So hi, today I'm going to do a demonstration on how to do a loop structure using a Java language as a programming language. So here we have the online IDE called the Replit, R-E-P-L-I-T, and I'm going to be typing my code here. So the problem I want to do is I want to compute the sum of numbers 1 to 10 using a loop. So I have the program set up like this. I'm going to start with a problem, a variable with actually I'm going to start with the for loop itself. So we have number of loops. We can have a do while loop, a while loop, or a for loop. For this problem I'm going to be using a for loop. So the syntax goes like this: for, and we have three parts of this for loop. First is the starting point, so I'm going to start with a variable name, and I have the data type that I can type inside the for loop. It is allowed, so I'm going to use a variable name called num. So my starting point for this loop is going to be at 1 because I want to start the numbers at 1, and I'm going to put semicolon to separate that part, and then comes the second part, and starting is num equals 1, and second part is where we're going to end. And how far do I want to go with the num? I want to go with the num until it is less than or equal to 10. So the starting point is 1 and the end point is 10, and then the third part is how do we go from the start to the end? What's the order of operations? How do we progress from 1 to 10? So I'm going to say we're going to add 1 to each of the items. It goes from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on. So I'm going to say it like this: num equals num plus 1. So what it means is we have the three parts separated by the two semicolons: starting point, end point, and how do we go from the start to the end, and in this case by adding a 1. So I'm going to put a couple more curly brackets like that to show. So this is the scope of my from line 4 to line 6 is where I'm going to have the content for the loop. So what am I going to do is, if I were to just show you what's happening here, if we just ask it to print those values num, this variable, and if we were to put a semicolon, and if I were to run this, and we'll give it 10 seconds for it to run. There you see the output. It'll run each time. It'll run the loop from starting point 1, and it'll increment 1 at a time to the number 1 to 2 to 3 all the way to 10. So it loops 10 times and gives you the result because I ask it to print this value of the num. So next I want to add another variable up here, so I'm going to actually use it between line number 3 and line number 4, and I'm going to say it's also an integer data type to hold integer values, and I'm going to add the variable sum, and I'm going to start with a value of 0 for the sum. So I'm going to come in between line number 5 and line number 6, and I'm going to use that sum variable with the num variable as a loop counter to add one number rather to the sum. So I'm going to say sum equals sum plus num. So what am I doing? As the num goes from 1 to 10, it's going to take each value of them and it's going to keep on adding to this sum counter. Remember, the sum started with 0. So if we were to just add that by use a plus sign to separate it like that with another blank double quotation, so it shows a blank space, and if I write sum and num, and if I run it, let's see what we're going to get. And as you can see, we have two columns of data, one for the num as you had before from 1 to 10, and then the progression in the second column is the summation of those numbers 1 to 55. So let's make it a little bit more nicer. I'm going to put another text string like this: sum sum of 1, 2. That's just a label. So it'll say sum of 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, and so on, and put an equal sign here and say sum, so it makes it a little bit more, the output looks a little bit more nicer. And if I were to run it, let's see how it's going to look. And now you can see those 10 lines again. So it'll say sum of 1 to 1 is 1, sum of 1 to 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, sum of 1 to 3 is 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6, and so on, is equal to 55. So let's actually trace this a little bit. I'm going to use some comments down below to show what we just did. So on line 2 of that screen, can you see? I'm sorry, on line 4, I started with a value of sum being initialized to 0. Add another one. Now on line 5, we're going to start with the first value of that loop, which is num equals to 1. And then on line number 6, we have that formula, sum equals to itself plus num. So I'm going to plug those values in here. The initial value of the sum from line 12 was 0, and from the line above, num is equal to 1. So that's how the sum 0 to 1 became. After the first iteration of the loop, the sum was equal to 1. So you can see, if you refer to the first line, that's what happened. Sum of 1 to 1. Num is 1 and sum is 1, as you can see from this trace in items in here. Let's continue on to the next one. So when in line 5, we have the next iteration of the loop when num is equal to 2. And if you go to line number 6, you can see the sum being modified. Sum is equal to sum plus num. And if we plug in those numbers, it's a comment, and sum, the last value of the sum, now sum was modified in the previous step to 1. We're going to plug that in here for sum, and the current value of the num is in here, is equal to 2. If we add those two, can you see now the sum of 1 to 2 becomes 3. So we can do one more for clarification purposes. Go back to the third iteration of the loop now, when num increases by 1 from 2 to 3, and therefore on line number 6, we have that equation being modified, sum equals to itself sum plus num, and if we plug in the last value of sum, as you can see from here, that last value of sum was 3, and the current value of num, which is also 3. If we add those two, we get sum of the numbers from 1 to 3, that is 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6, and so on. So if you go through, these are the tracing of the first iteration, the first 3 iterations of the 3 loop runs, and it'll do the same thing. It'll run 10 times, and the sum will be added all the way up to 55. So you can do this with other variations. You don't have to add with 1. If you want to add the even numbers, for example, you can increment it by 2. You can have the starting point any other value, not from 1. You can have it from 101, and you can go to 110, and so on. So the depth of the variety of problems that you can do is many.